Hello, everyone. This is Matt Kaufman, host of the Breaking Bread podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Before we get to today's episode, I want to announce that the Abide 3-week training is now open for registration. The discipleship training will be May 11th through the 31st, 2024, located in Peachtree City, Georgia. This discipleship training is an intentional time to cultivate your discipleship to Jesus and be equipped with the tools to invite others to be his disciples. You can learn more and register on our website. Go to our website at accounseling.org and put in the search menu, Abide. There are limited seats available, so if you're interested, check it out today.
The thing about it, what it says is, I feel maxed out. I feel like what I'm under, the stress load I'm under, is bigger than my coping resources. And so the more that happens, the bigger the weight is, and the less coping resources, the more somebody feels that helplessness and overwhelm.
Welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, a podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Kathy Knochel, Ted Witzig Jr. are with me here today. We're going to talk about depression.
Yes.
Because it's not an isolated condition. So speak to the prevalence, speak to the topic.
Matt, depression is one of the most common things that are treated in counseling centers and in primary care physician offices. And it's one of those things that's been referred to as the common cold of mental illness because it's the most common thing that people experience in this space. It can sometimes occur by itself, so somebody can come with depression as a primary issue, but it also tends to tag along as a result of other things, result of addiction, result of trauma, result of an anxiety disorder. And so it's oftentimes a passenger, at least, if not a co-driver, in the things that people are experiencing. And it affects people across life and lifespan. And Kathy, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Speak to, Kathy, help us get a feel for what a person that endures depression is experiencing. What might they be experiencing?
So I think the thing to note too, is that we see depression in kids as well as adolescents, teenagers, young adults, all the way to old age, and depending on life stage, it may look a little bit different. It's going to come across differently depending on where you're at.
I think that perspective is helpful, both the prevalence as well as this is not isolated to certain age groups, but is throughout the lifespan. One of my goals I would like to have for this podcast is for us to articulate depression in a way that those who experience it says, yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. That's helpful to be understood like that. And for those who have no experience of depression to say, okay, now I have a growing empathy for that situation, right?
I think the picture that I like to use is it's kind of like trying to drive through life with the brake pressed on. Everything is a little bit more difficult for the person that's experiencing depression. Things that were once enjoyable to them, or the things that they just did like out of habit or as part of their regular schedule, everything gets just a little bit more difficult. It takes longer time to complete something that they normally did in a specific time. And there's also just this sense of like maybe the types of interactions that used to feel renewing to them doesn't feel as renewing. There's a hopelessness, loss of interest in the activities. And then also just while we a lot of times will think of depressed means you're sad, certainly an individual facing depression is sad. There's also so many other emotions, kind of like the hopelessness I talked about, and sometimes it can come with some agitation or even some of that anxiety can still be felt. There's just a range of symptoms that can be there.
Depression can also show up as mild, moderate, or severe, okay? And so across that, you see, it can be like gray over somebody's life, and they just feel a gray cloud weighing down on them, all the way to someone isn't able to function.
And even suicidal.
That's correct.
So we have this this term clinical depression. Are you looking for those symptoms? What does it mean to be clinically depressed?
Yep. So I'm going to go through kind of the main symptoms that we use to make a diagnosis. Depression as a diagnosis has to have at least 5 of 9 symptoms for at least 2 weeks. Okay. So this is more of a steady state. It is, and 2 weeks isn't long necessarily. I'm not saying it's a long period of time, but we're not talking about a passing mood or a shift or waking up on the wrong side of the bed is one of the things. So with these, you have to have there are 2 symptoms that you have to have either of or both in order to get a diagnosis. The first one is sad or depressed mood, and that's what most people think depression is. That might be tearfulness, it might be sad, it might be just discouragement in that outlook. The other one is loss of interest in things you would normally find pleasurable. That's called anhedonia. And what's interesting is a lot of times people with that second one, that loss of interest, might not even realize they're depressed, okay? And so they're feeling this heaviness, this gray lack of enjoyment in life and things like that. But when we'll say as counselors, I think you're dealing with depression, they'll go, well, I'm not crying, and I'm not sitting around. And, well, that's because they have a kind of a caricature of what depression is. So first one.
As you mentioned that one, there's a certain amount of empathy that comes to me when you mentioned that precise one.
Yeah.
It's not only is there a dark cloud, but there is no sun.
That's right.
Type of concept, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that happens is that when you think about life, there is painful things that happen, but then there's also the absence of joy.
The retraction of those good things.
That's exactly right. And that's why with depression, to get a diagnosis, you just have to have one or the other of those, but oftentimes, and again, the more severe that somebody is, the likely that they'll have both. The next thing is that has to do with appetite or weight loss or gain. And so some people will gain weight and eat when they're depressed. Some people will lose their appetite and will lose weight. So this is an interesting thing about depression is the same diagnosis can have different symptoms in different people. And so loss of weight or gain is the same thing is true here with sleep. Sleep is often affected in depression. So some people have hypersomnia, meaning they want to sleep all the time or sleep too much. And then other people have insomnia, and they just can't sleep, and sleep escapes them. Or a very common one is called early morning waking, where they'll wake in the middle of the night and then lay awake and then ruminate. Another one that has both sides is called feeling agitated. Okay, so feeling this agitation inside, or feeling slowed down, and so there's one is a keyed up feeling, one is a sluggish feeling of going away. Loss of energy is very common, and so people's motivation are oftentimes affected by that. And then one that I want to call a special attention to is these feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. And that's where somebody has lower self-esteem or just feels lower about themselves when they're depressed. That one makes sense. The reason I want to highlight this one is because this is the one where people will oftentimes feel more detached from God. And they'll feel dry in their spiritual walk. In fact, they'll say, I just don't feel like my prayers go up. I don't feel much in that. And so there's a disconnection.
So for the Christian, this one's especially acute.
That's right. And because it's a symptom, but they will oftentimes read it as a problem of their spirituality, which then they feel cut off from God instead of seeing God as their resource. There are just 2 more here. The next one is decreased concentration. And this people's memory, their concentration can be impacted so they can't focus at work and at church and just the things, getting their schoolwork done. So you see secondary problems like grades start to drop and things of that nature. And then lastly, the thoughts of death or suicide, wanting to die. And again, that could be passive in the sense of I just wish that I would die, all the way to active in the sense of this is how I will hasten that. And I think we need to see, Matt, is that suicidal thoughts, the thoughts of death, the thing about it, what it says is, I feel maxed out. I feel like what I'm under, the stress load I'm under, is bigger than my coping resources. And so the more that happens, the bigger the weight is, and the less coping resources, the more somebody feels that helplessness and overwhelm.
So you just gave us about 9 different
That's
ear
right,
markers.
9
And to be clinically depressed, you need to flag how many?
5 of 9
5 of
for a
those
period
9
of 2 weeks.
For
Yep.
a period of 2 weeks.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think if you take all those symptoms and just kind of get this picture here. So when an individual is feeling a loss of interest in going and doing the things that they used to do, and then they stay home, they become disconnected from their groups that they're usually a part of. And so then that feeling of worthlessness and overwhelm starts. And what I like to say is you just kind of see this downward spiral of it. Like you feel too bad to go out and do the things that you need to do and catch that joy that really would help in this moment. And then
It's a difficult loop.
Yes. Yeah.
So it just builds on itself, and it's a vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm.
People that are not familiar with depression will oftentimes just see the emotional component. They'll think, oh, it means sad mood, like crying and things like that. But depression affects people's moods, but it also affects their thinking, okay? The thoughts they think, they can feel more hopeless, discouraged, frustration, irritability, those kind of things can come out in their thoughts and emotions. It affects their behaviors, their motivation, their wanting to get a project done, or even being able to muster the energy to go out and exercise or do those things that we know are good for us. Socially, people will oftentimes start to either step back from their social connections, or when they're with people, will still feel alone. And so it's that I'm surrounded by people, but I'm very lonely kind of thing. And then another aspect then is that spiritual disconnect. And I want to make clear here that it is obviously, if somebody is living in sin and they're far from God and they have a heavy conscience and all those things, yes, that's going to bear down on them, and they're going to feel the heaviness of that. In major depression, what you have is somebody who is not in a bad place spiritually, but who starts to feel like God is far from them, isn't listening to them. And then it's interesting how our adversary, Satan, kicks people when they're down. They're dealing with depression, then he starts to dredge. Well, what about this sin from your past? And were you really forgiven? And those kind of things.
I want to put my finger on the heartache, and I think probably a unique heartache of this particular condition, and that is its very nature makes it worse.
Yeah.
Its very nature makes it worse. A broken arm doesn't, by its nature, beget more broken arms. It just does. It's not the way it works.
That's right.
A cold, by its nature, doesn't beget more colds.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think this is really unique, and I think it's important that we understand this. And so now I really am interested. What does good care look like? And I'm really thinking about two people here in the audience, right? Those who are very near to the experience of depression, and also to those who encounter and live with and engage with those who are depressed, right? So I want to handle both of those listeners.
Yep.
I might just speak to the people around an individual that's struggling with depression or that you're starting to notice some signs of it. I think that because you're not inside the other person knowing exactly how they're thinking or feeling, it can feel really confusing, and it can kind of feel like, why can't they just be happier, or why don't they just leave their house, or why don't they just, fill in the blank? And so I think that the first thing I would just say is just remember the piece of compassion is really important. Like, we don't know everybody's stories. We don't know exactly what it is that they're struggling with. And so being able to have more of a help me understand perspective with those that are struggling is important. And then I think too, just knowing, like, the right things to do or the right things to say are really important. Telling somebody to smile more or stop crying or, and I know that that's obvious. We don't say those things, but sometimes the most helpful thing can be of like, I can just come be with you if you're having a hard time coming out, or I'm going for a walk. I'm going to walk by your house. I'm going to come with you. Because what the person needs that's depressed is they need that person to come alongside and do it with them until they can do it themselves.
Yep. I think I really appreciate that, is that coming alongside is really important because depression is very isolating and it does feed on itself in that way. I do also want to say that it is that when you're in a relationship with somebody who's depressed, if it's your spouse or a child or whatever, that can be stressful, right? It's because you're trying to go about life and even you're trying to encourage them and you might feel like it falls flat. So it impacts the family system. I think that one of the things that Kathy said is probably one of the biggest keys for helpers, and that is, along with compassion, it is doing things with the person, okay? And so I remember I've worked with numbers of cases where young mothers or mothers dealing with postpartum situations where they've had difficulty during that time caring for the children and keeping the family going. And what they need is for families and friends to come and help. But here's the problem. If someone is depressed and they're feeling like a bad mother already, okay, and then somebody comes in and does all those things and the person's looking and going, they can do it, I can't do it, versus being able to say, here, let's fold some laundry together. Just for a little bit. Let's fold a few things together. And so that's just an example. And if it was a teen, you might say, hey, let's shoot some baskets together. Or it is going to be way more helpful with the coming alongside and helping to lift up than it is to give directions.
This was very helpful. I think Ted and Kathy gave us a framework for which to understand this very common mental and emotional condition of depression. And this will conclude part 1. But when we return, we're going to look to the hope through depression. And I hope that you can join us.